This is the last video for this week, and I'm on chapter 9. And this is a picture straight out of the textbook where they talk about Rodinia, Rodinia. Earlier on, you learned about Pangaea, and that was a continent that Alfred Wegener identified back in 1912 when he said that Pangaea came together, the supercontinent of Pangaea came together 245 million years ago, right? So let's take a look at that again. Pangaea, that was the first supercontinent that was identified, and we learned about that when we talked about continental drift and plate tectonics. So this supercontinent Pangaea existed not during the Proterozoic, but in the last eon of geologic time, called the Phanerozoic. It existed 245 million years ago, right? But since Wegener's time, we have now identified a total of 4 supercontinents that existed in the geologic past. 4. And we're going to talk about them one at a time. The first supercontinent, let's make a list here to make it easier on you here. There's 4 supercontinents you need to know about. Supercontinent is when all the continents are connected together. The first one was Columbia, which was thought to exist about 2.1 billion years ago. Then Rodinia, about 1 billion years ago. And then Pangaea, 600 million years ago. And last but not least, Pangaea, 245 million years ago. Sometime in the future, probably about 200 million years from now, everything will come together again and make a new continent, but we haven't given it a name yet. Okay, those are the 4 supercontinents you need to know about. These 2, Columbia and Rodinia, existed during the Proterozoic eon. The Proterozoic eon. Let's take a look at the first one. So, the first supercontinent that we know about is called Columbia, and it existed about 2 billion years ago. And it looks something like this. All the continents were together about 2 billion years ago. Then the continents broke apart along rift valleys and separated apart, and then they came together again at continental convergent plate boundaries, otherwise known as suture zones, to form the next supercontinent called Rodinia, which existed about 1 billion years ago. Then those broke apart along rift valleys again, forming separate continents until they came together to form the third supercontinent. This existed at the very end of the Proterozoic, and it's called Pangaea. This map here has Hebrew in it instead of English, but you can still see it. And then the last supercontinent, then Pangaea broke up about 600 million years ago along rift valleys, and they came together again in continental convergent plate boundaries, or suture zones, to form the last supercontinent called Pangaea. So I think you could see what's going on here. There's a cycle going on. Continents come together at continental convergent plate boundaries where they're sutured together. Then they break apart along rift valleys. Then they come together again. They break apart. They come together again. This is a cycle almost as old as the Earth itself. And the man who figured this out, his name was Wilson, so we call this Wilson supercycles, they're called. It's a cycle of continents coming together, breaking apart, coming together, breaking apart. Please don't forget, though, that Rodinia existed about 1 billion years ago, and then it started to break apart shortly thereafter. Another thing that's different about the Proterozoic is we get our first glacial deposits. So the Earth is cooling down. And here you can see glacial till. See how it's so poorly sorted? with angular particles typical of glacial till. It was deposited by ice. You can see the scratch marks left behind as the ice moved over the ground, and the ice is filled with debris, and that scratched the underlying rock. So we get our first glacial deposits, and you can see that these glacial deposits are found in all of these areas you see in light blue during the Proterozoic eon. Ice covered all of these different areas. Remember, the continents were not in the same position as they are today back then. Oxygen starts to build up in the atmosphere. And why? Why do you think that might be? Well, we already talked about the cyanobacteria, the bacteria that produce the stromatolites. They photosynthesize, they release oxygen. So oxygen started to slowly build up in the Proterozoic eon. And we continue to form banded iron formations as we did in the previous eon, the Archean. Here you can see banded iron formations. Don't forget, they're an important source of iron ore. Anything you have around you made from steel, it comes from these banded iron formations that are mined. Let's talk a little bit about Proterozoic life. Proterozoic life continues to be a lot of these bacteria belonging to domain U bacteria, and these are prokaryotes. And we must get this we must understand this, that early life was prokaryotic, not eukaryotic. And this is a prokaryotic cell, and this is a eukaryotic cell. Remember the kinds of the domain Eukarya. What kingdoms are there? Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Fungi, Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Animalia. In English, protists, funguses, plants, and animals. These all sexual creatures have eukaryotic cells. All organisms that have gender have eukaryotic cells. But the earliest life forms were not sexual. They were prokaryotics. They were microscopic. They're very tiny creatures. And let's compare once again, so we get this under our belt, that what the earliest fossils and earliest forms of life that are all prokaryotic, and they had these kinds of cells, as opposed to the cells that eukaryotes have. Once again, the difference is eukaryotic cells are larger than prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells have a well-defined cell nucleus, so that you have a nuclear membrane separating the nucleus of the cell from the rest of the cytoplasm in the cell. And inside the cell nucleus, we have chromosomes, which you inherited from your mother and father through sexual reproduction. No, the stork did not drop you off at your parents' doorstep. Sexual reproduction is how these chromosomes are passed on to you. And they're inside of every single one of your cells. Half of them from your father, half of the genetic material from your mother. And then you also have these walled off portions of the cells, which we call mitochondria in animals, and we have chloroplasts for plants. Animals, mitochondria are used to convert the food you eat into energy. So there's kind of like powerhouses in all animals. Plants, on the other hand, have these chloroplasts or plastids, where they use sunlight and to make their own food. They produce their own food. Hence, plants are called producers. Animals are consumers because they have to eat. Another important thing to note is that DNA for animals is also stored in the mitochondria. It's also stored in the mitochondria. And so there's two ways of doing DNA studies when we explore our evolutionary past. It's the nuclear DNA, and it's through the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, it's important to note, is only effective from a woman to her mother, to her mother, to her mother, to her mother. And that's what we're best at the moment. So that's what we call the matrilineal DNA line. If you want to study male chromosomes, which is the Y chromosome, then you have to go into the nucleus and look at the DNA in the nucleus of the cell. And then you could, Y chromosome DNA analysis is done using nuclear DNA. And it goes from a man to his father, to his father, to his father, to his father. That's called patrilineal DNA. And we're getting much better at looking at that. But we're still better at using the mitochondrial DNA, which works better through the female line. So sexual creatures inherit their DNA half from the father, half from the mother. Prokaryotes are different. The DNA is stored and it's mixed up all throughout the cell. There is no cell nucleus, and then it'll divide in half, and it'll inherit the characteristics of the original undivided cell. This is called cloning. Prokaryotes reproduce by cloning. There is no male and there's no female. There's no gender. Don't forget, animals, plants, funguses, and protists, kingdom Protista, kingdom Fungi, kingdom Plantae, kingdom Animalia, all belong to domain Eukarya. And domain Archaea and domain Bacteria, which is EU bacteria, sometimes it's just bacteria, but we're going to use EU bacteria. Those are all prokaryotes. Domain Eukarya, those are all eukaryotes. All sexual organisms are eukaryotes. So one important thing that happened during the Proterozoic is we get our first eukaryotes. And these primitive looking eukaryotes belonging to kingdom Protista, they're single-celled, might not seem spectacular to you, but they are a huge evolutionary jump, because eukaryotic cells, like the ones you see here, lead to more complexity and will lead to larger body size and will lead to sexual reproduction. So when did the first eukaryotes evolve in the rock record? During the Proterozoic eon. We get our first sexual creatures, such as these. These are called Acrotarks. So Acrotarks are a type of fossil, Acrotarks, that are first found in Proterozoic rocks, and this is a huge advance in life because these are now visible to the naked eye. They're not microfossils, they're macrofossils. They're cyst-sized, so maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch long sometimes, and these are some of our first eukaryotes. And in the next video, next week, we'll start talking about if we had a world that in the Archean and most of the Proterozoic where there were no eukaryotes, there were just prokaryotes, and all of a sudden, about 1.5 billion years ago, eukaryotes appeared. The only logical conclusion you can come up with is that prokaryotes must have evolved to form our first eukaryotes. And we'll talk about how that happened in next week's videos.